Okay, my name is Ed Song. I teach moral and political philosophy at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. I worship, very proud to say that I worship at the Free Methodist Church of Santa Barbara. And it's really, really great to be here today. It's a huge privilege for me. This is my second Justice Network Summit. I was at the last one in Los Angeles. But I started to meet people in the Justice Network at my first general conference in 2019. And I was just meeting all of these amazing people. And I was like, who are these people? They are two commandment people. You know, so there's the first great commandment, love the Lord God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And we like that. That's really important. But some people, a lot of Christians in our country, can't seem to count higher than one. Because there is a second great commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so for me, it was an incredibly powerful thing meeting Christians, Free Methodist Christians, doing amazing work around the country, making sure that we are engaging with our neighbors, we are loving our neighbors, and we are bringing the love of Jesus Christ to the lost, the lonely, and the least. So I am never more hopeful than I am when I am with the Free Methodist Justice Network. I'm never more optimistic about Christianity in our country than I'm here. So it's really, really awesome for me to be here. And I also feel kind of bad because we go from the prophetic word hour to class time a little bit. So most of my academic research as a philosopher is pretty abstract. It focuses on very narrow, very abstract, very theoretical questions about the nature of justice and inequality. Though I'll say that over the years, I've become more interested in questions about public policy, right? Not just in trying to understand what justice is, but trying to understand what kinds of policies, programs, and practices would actually help to achieve it. And so today's talk is in that vein. I'm going to take for granted today that poverty and excessive inequality are bad things from the perspective of justice. I'm also going to take it for granted that we all understand that it is an essential part of being a follower of Jesus Christ that we care for the most disadvantaged. If you disagree with those things, you're not going to like what comes in the next 30 minutes. But hopefully today, my talk will give us some ideas about how we can do that. Because what I'm going to be talking about today is a real revolution in the realms of developmental psychology that has changed how we understand poverty, and especially its effects on young children, but then really on all of us. So this talk is entitled, In the Beginning, Neglect, Trauma, and the Roots of Poverty. And the in the beginning part here refers to this new understanding that we have for how crucial the first 2 years of a child's development are for their intellectual, emotional, and even physical development. If a child experiences excessive neglect, trauma, or stress in that critical first 2-year window, or a little bit more generally, if they experience chronic traumatic experiences during their childhood and adolescence, then the normal process of their development can become short-circuited in ways that lead to lasting deficits that can really undermine their lives. We often talk about the cycle of poverty, right? And what this new research allows us to understand, it allows us to understand the cycle at a neurochemical level, so that we can get very detailed understandings of how it is exactly that poverty begets poverty, that brokenness begets brokenness, and what we might actually be able to do to help break it and to help young persons develop in the ways that are necessary for their own flourishing and that of their communities. And I really think that with regard to virtually every social problem that we care about, it's kind of grounded in these childhood traumas. Another way of thinking about all of this is to consider the standard progressive and conservative understandings of how poverty arises. For progressives, Poverty primarily comes from structural or institutional factors. People become poor because they are a victim of social forces that are outside of their control. They live in neighborhoods maybe that are racked by economic disadvantage, so they don't have access to good jobs, or they go to bad schools, so they don't have the ability to get a decent education. Their communities become subject to disorder because of the cumulative effect of racist policies that have resulted in the lack of mobility and underinvestment in those communities. The great Harvard sociologist William Julius Wilson has been writing about this stuff in the 60s, tracking the way in which the social problems that we associate with inner city black neighborhoods really arise out of these big structural changes that are happening with regard to inner city factories moving out of those neighborhoods. People are left in economic distress, and then this whole series of problems arise. In contrast, what do conservatives say? Conservatives tend to see poverty as arising from individual failures. Individuals need to work harder, make good decisions, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? They talk about how it's a culture problem or a value problem, but it ultimately comes down to like the individual work ethic, and people just need to button down and be responsible and take care of themselves and their families. Amen, sister. Now, this new research allows us to see the ways in which these stories actually kind of reinforce each other. It is true that poor individual decisions contribute to poverty and social disorder. But where do these poor decisions come from? They arise because of structural or institutional factors that undermine the social conditions that are necessary for human development and real human agency. And then this, in turn, helps to create the structural or institutional conditions that erode human development, and then the cycle just continues. And again, what I'll do today is try to unpack this new body of research on the cognitive and emotional development of children and young people, and try to explain the way that poverty can undermine this developmental cycle. And then to be hopeful, actually, about the way in which these new understandings have led to new public policy interventions or new ideas about how we can interrupt this cycle of poverty. And that might actually help us as Christians think about how we might try to bring justice to the most disadvantaged in our communities. Okay? So now, our story about this research is going to start in an unlikely place. That is not... Sorry. Let's go here. This is Nicolae Ceausescu. In 1965, he was elected as the General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party. And shortly thereafter, he issued Decree 770, which was aimed at increasing the country's declining population. It made divorce very hard to get. It provided subsidies to families. And the decree was very successful. The population of Romania began to swell, but this actually led to further problems, because as families started to experience poverty, it led to widespread child abandonment. So Romania started to create a system of very large institutional orphanages to care for these children. Now, when Ceausescu was overthrown in 1989, the Soviet bloc countries dissolved, the Berlin Wall fell, Romania became open to Western countries, and then these orphanages became the object of attention from Western academics who were interested in child welfare and development. And now this attention came from the fact that it was clear that the kids in these orphanages suffered from a high frequency of pretty profound developmental problems. This led to the creation of what was called the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, in which a number of Western academics and nonprofits worked together to try to place some of these children into foster families, tracking their development along with the development of children who remained in the orphanages. And now the study's findings were very striking. Children who stayed in these large institutional settings suffered from lower IQs, stunted physical growth. They had difficulty forming emotional attachments. Researchers actually found that the telomeres, which are these protective caps that sit at the end of your chromosomes, they kind of act as buffers, protecting against the erosion of the DNA in your chromosomes. People actually found that the children who stayed in these orphanages, their telomeres were shorter and more wore down, depending upon the amount of time that the children had spent in an institutional setting. A variety of tests also found that they had unusually low activity in their brains. In contrast, orphans who were placed in foster families before their second birthday often made up for some of these deficits. Now, this Bucharest study encouraged widespread research exploring the complicated process in which young children develop. In the Romanian orphanages, the physical needs of the children were generally being met. They had all the nutritional needs that they needed in order to grow. But the problem was that these children received very little attention of any kind. One of the American researchers working on the Bucharest project, a Harvard neuroscientist named Charles Nelson, visited one of these orphanages in the late 90s, and he was struck by the silence in these very large wards. There was no talking, no playing, or even crying. And so Nelson observed it would be dead silent, all of the babies sitting on their backs and staring at the ceiling. Why cry when nobody is going to pay attention to you? So research over the last 30 years has come to show that a child's cognitive development is not a passive process. When children are born, they are born with brains that are still in the process of wiring and forming up. And this process does not happen by itself, but is in fact initiated by a kind of back and forth serve and response pattern of social interaction. So here is a little brief video. I could try to unpack this, but there's a little 5-minute video that's going to explain this, this science of child development in a more succinct fashion than I could.
Everyone in a community has a vested interest in everyone else's children, because everyone else's children determine the next adult population that makes for a successful society. Built into our biology is the need to have responsive interactions with adults.
Neglect for children is when they don't get what the brain is expecting to get, what the child is expecting to get, what we are biologically prepared and waiting for, which is input from those around us.
It's this back and forth serve and return interaction that literally shapes the architecture of the brain.
Serve and return begins when a child looks at something or observes something, makes an utterance, and that represents the serve. And the return is when the parent notices the child doing these things and responds to the child.
Under conditions where serve and return is broken, you literally are pulling away what is the essential ingredient of the development of human brain architecture.
There was a really compelling series of experiments where they started by videotaping the mother and the baby engaging in cooing and smiling. And then they asked the mother to basically put on a blank face and not respond at all. When a baby is not attended to, that is a sign of danger to the baby biologically. So the stress systems become activated.
In a brain that is constantly bathed in stress hormones, not that's up and down, that comes with normal development, certain key synapses, the connections between nerves, fail to form, and critical regions of the brain.
So neglect both fails to provide the stimulation that's needed to develop the basic architecture, and when it's at a certain level, is one of the most potent activators of the stress biology of a young child. So you get a double whammy.
Science points to 4 categories of this spectrum of neglect. The first category would be what's called occasional inattention, where children experience responsiveness most of the time, but occasionally adults don't respond. There's no harm in that, and in fact, there's probably some benefit.
A child can learn to self-soothe and explore the environment, and all of those opportunities build brain architecture.
The second category, scientists would call chronic understimulation, is where on a regular basis, children have less interaction with the adults around them than is needed for healthy development.
Those children typically, when provided with enriched learning opportunities and more typical levels of serve and return, will show catch-up.
The third category is what science would call severe neglect in a family where not only are there prolonged periods of inattention and lack of responsiveness, but often also associated with not being fed enough, not being bathed enough, not having basic needs met.
Neglect is a huge problem in the U.S. Children are much more likely to be neglected than they are to experience any other kind of maltreatment.
We see the child really being at risk for much more substantial kinds of deficits down the road that don't necessarily get easily fixed or ameliorated. This is where we really need to think about more complicated and often more intensive strategies to help undo those effects.
The fourth category, called severe neglect, generally found in institutional settings, is the result of children living in kind of warehoused type situation in orphanages.
And it doesn't have to even be as extreme as orphanages. It can be experiences that are regretfully occurring in many, many parts of our country.
Often institutional care in this country is under the euphemistic name of transitional care or temporary care or assessment facilities.
If you think about what institutional or residential care would look like for an infant, where there's somebody new coming onto the shift every 8 hours, it really alters the development of the child's brain architecture and other aspects of the child's development.
We have the potential to change children's developmental trajectories.
Interventions can apply to parents, to foster parents or adoptive parents, child care settings, Head Start settings, and other kinds of settings. And really, what they're about is attuning people to the serve and return process.
Neglecting young children is neglecting the foundations of a healthy next generation. The community pays a huge price later in terms of the problems of the next generation, whether it be educational achievement, economic productivity, good citizenship, the ability to parent the next generation. All of the things that have to do with a healthy, prosperous society.
So I hope the information in that video made sense, right? We've all seen this process of child-parent interaction before. Infants babble or point and wait for a response from the parent. The parent notices what the child is doing and copies them. That's serve and response. And this rather mundane cycle of social interaction is, in fact, integral to kickstarting the whole process of childhood cognitive and emotional development. And again, they described it as being a kind of a double whammy of childhood neglect. And it comes from the fact that children who experience such neglect fail to receive the social stimulation that is necessary for normative cognitive and emotional development. So again, that social interaction kickstarts the normal process of emotional development, of cognitive development. And so, if that didn't happen, that's bad enough, right? But the double whammy is that when kids do not get that attention, it generates stress. And stress itself has extremely serious effects on childhood health and development. Stress activates our fight or flight response system. It simulates the release of cortisol and other stress hormones. Occasional stress is a good thing, right? But regular chronic stress can be extremely deleterious to our long-term health. Now, if we could go, yeah, perfect, right there. So toxic stress has itself been the object of a number of scientific studies. The most influential of these has become known as the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACE study. This was a study that was conducted in San Diego. There was a very large HMO that had thousands of patients, so they had a ton of data. And they actually began to notice, quite accidentally, this interesting correlation between childhood traumatic experiences and then negative health later in life. So they surveyed all of these adults about their childhood traumatic experiences. What does this mean? So physical or emotional abuse in the family as they were growing up, substance abuse, certainly sexual assault, severe neglect, divorce, domestic violence. Okay? So they surveyed people and then correlated this to their current health outcomes. And so if they would give the survey, did you experience domestic violence in your household? That's an ACE of 1, right? Was there drug abuse or mental illness in your family when you're growing up? That's an ACE score of 2. And so they stack up on each other. And first of all, the ACE study found that these adverse childhood experiences were relatively common. 1/4 of all participants grew up in a household with an alcoholic or a drug user. 1/4 reported physical abuse. A full 1/3 of participants surveyed reported some form of childhood trauma. And what was even more interesting was the effect that multiple adverse childhood experiences had on current adult health outcomes. Adults who had ACE scores of 4 or higher, that is, people who had experienced 4 separate traumatic experiences, were twice as likely to smoke. They were 7 times more likely to be alcoholics. They were 6 times more likely to have had sex before the age of 15. They were twice as likely to have been diagnosed with cancer. They were twice as likely to have heart disease. They were 4 times more likely to suffer from emphysema or chronic bronchitis. They were more likely to suffer from childhood asthma. They were 12 times more likely to have attempted suicide than those with an ACE score of 0. Men with an ACE score of 6 or higher were 46 times more likely to have injected drugs than men who had ACE scores of 0. Even if a person with a high ACE score didn't engage in any risky behavior, like smoking or drug use, they were still 360 times more likely to develop heart disease than someone whose ACE score was 0. Right? So understand that. It's easy enough to understand how somebody grows up, has really bad traumatic experiences in their childhood, and then they start to develop, they rely on coping mechanisms to help them manage their trauma, right? So they smoke or they drink. It's easy enough to understand how somebody who becomes a chronic smoker is going to have a higher incidence of cancer. But the research controls for all of that. Even if you do not smoke or engage in other negative health behaviors, this whole range of bad health outcomes follows from it. So the problem isn't merely risky behavior, but rather the fact that chronic stress overstimulates our cardiovascular and immune systems, making it more likely that we experience heart disease, illness, and even cancer. Such toxic stress, of course, also has extremely negative effects on childhood development. Children who experience chronic stress find it harder to sit still and follow directions. As teenagers, they are more likely to be drawn to high-risk behaviors. As adults, they often show increased aggression, impulsive behavior, weakened cognition, and an inability to distinguish between real and imagined threats. Remember, think back again to that, the progressive and the conservative stories about the origins of poverty. The conservatives are like, it's an individual problem, you gotta work harder. But now we see that process is much more complicated, right? It's much harder to have the kind of effective human agency that leads to good choices, good life outcomes, a flourishing individual life. Sorry, I can't remember how I started that sentence. Much easier, much harder. You get the picture, right? It's much harder to do those things when you've experienced a traumatic childhood, a childhood characterized by neglect and chaos. Now, Nadine Burke-Harris is a physician who was at the forefront of this research. She started an inner city clinic in San Francisco that started to explore these connections, and she started to, she gives a great TED Talk. It's like one of the most watched TED Talks on these issues. She was appointed as the first Surgeon General for the state of California. She wrote a book about these things. And Burke-Harris writes this: in many cases, what looks like a social situation is actually a neurochemical situation. You can trace the pathology as it moves from the molecular level to the social level. You have a girl who grows up in a household where there's domestic violence or some kind of horrible arguing between her parents. That triggers her fight or flight response, which affects the way that the hormone receptors in her brain developed. And as she grows, her stress regulation system goes off track. Maybe she overreacts to confrontation, or maybe it's the opposite. She doesn't recognize risky situations and feels comfortable only around a lot of drama. So she ends up with a partner who's abusive. Then the pathology moves from the individual level to the household level, because that partner beats the kids. And then their son goes to a school where 10 out of 30 kids are experiencing the same thing. Those kids create in the classroom a culture of hitting, of fighting, not just for the 10 kids, but for all 30. Then those kids get a little older and they're teenagers and they behave violently, and then they beat their kids, and it's just accepted. And the cycle obviously continues and is perpetuated. What Burke-Harris articulates so well is that what looks like an individual social problem, that kid needs to just get his act together, or individual bad behavior, is in fact rooted in complex social problems that undermines a person's ability to exercise meaningful agency. And then these problems just perpetuate themselves. In Burke-Harris's medical practice, just 3% of patients with an ACE score of 0 exhibit learning or behavioral problems. Among patients with an ACE score of 4 or higher, that figure is 51%, right? So these behavioral problems, they don't just come from nowhere. Now, these statistics and these studies are very bracing. But if this story seems dark and pessimistic, there is also some good news. Identifying the social causes of many of these behavioral outcomes also gives way to new attempts to address them. And now one of the most popular and interesting of these is a new program that goes by the unwieldy name of Maternal Infant Early Childhood Home Visitation Program, or MICV. This is a federally funded program. There are MICV programs operating in all 50 states of our country. And the way it works is that they send trained specialists, they're usually nurses or social workers, to visit the homes of at-risk parents who are expecting. An important feature of this program is that these visits happen in a child's home, because then the parents feel more at ease there, and the nurse is in a position to fully evaluate the conditions in which a child is being born and raised. The nurse practitioner then provides medical, health, diet, and parenting advice to the expectant parents. Usually, or hopefully, they begin before a child is born. The nurse is providing medical care, medical advice, nutritional advice. Once the baby is born, the visits continue, and practitioners continue to provide coaching, parenting advice, mentorship, child-rearing tips during the child's first 2 years, even as they are also assessing the parents, the baby, and the household for warning signs. Really, what they're doing is providing the kind of one-on-one, life-on-life mentoring that is so essential for at-risk mothers and parents. The challenges of this work are remarkable, and such nurse practitioners are typically working in very, very challenging family circumstances. I'm going to give you all a list of resources at the end of this presentation. One of them is an article from the New Yorker that includes this incredible profile of a MICV program in South Louisiana that provides a really, really vivid picture of the challenges and possibilities of such work. But the hopeful thing about such programs is that they actually seem to produce rather remarkable results. So, mothers in home visiting programs were 10 to 20% less likely to have another child in their teens or early 20s. Fathers were 46% more likely to be present in recipient households. Recipient families relied on welfare or food stamp programs less frequently. For every dollar that was spent on a McV program, between $126 to $570 was saved. Why? Thanks to reduced money spent on hospitals, welfare, and incarceration in those communities. Children participating in a home visit program were 40% less likely to require treatment for injuries between 25 and 50 months of age. They were 35% less likely to visit an emergency room. They were 4.5 times less likely to die in the first 9 years of their lives. They scored higher on math and reading achievement tests at the age of 12. They were 59% less likely to have been arrested before turning 16, and were 48% less likely to have experienced abuse. One of the cool things about this federal funding is that it is always linked to data collection. So they are able to accumulate really significant amounts of data showing the way in which these programs really end up changing the community, not just the families, but the communities in pretty profound ways. And they obviously are making people pretty enthusiastic about the potential of these kinds of interventions. All right, so I've been going on and kind of lecturing at you in an academic way for a while, so let me try to wrap this up. What does this mean for us? In the Old Testament, we constantly see the way in which the laws of Israel called for God's people to care for the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, and the stranger. These four constitute what the Christian philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff calls the quartet of the vulnerable. And they represent a kind of a shorthand for those who are the most marginalized and at risk within a society. Obviously, things haven't changed very much because we still have the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, and the poor, and they are still the most vulnerable within our society. And as Christians, we understand that we have a special call to bring justice to the most vulnerable. And there are few in our country that are more vulnerable than young children living in poverty. All of this research on the effects of trauma and deprivation are bracing as we see the way in which sin, both individual sin and then also social sin, can do so much harm to young children and their families. But it's also hopeful because virtually every social problem that we care about can be traced back to these harms. I work with a nonprofit in Santa Barbara that does a lot of work in homelessness in our community and on trafficking. And the people who do that work, they're constantly saying, we feel like we are pulling people out of the river, right? Because it is really clear that you end up on the streets or you end up in really bad situations because really bad things have been happening in your life. The hopeful thing about this research is that it gives us one way in which we can help people from falling in the river in the first place. And so my hope is that familiarity with this research can help us to think about how we can better meet the needs of young children, parents of young children in our communities, bringing the peace and justice of God to those who really are the most vulnerable. I know that a lot of amazing things are happening in your churches. Hopefully, all of this stuff will provide some new ideas, new ways of thinking about how we can help the most vulnerable. And again, if you're interested in this material, I strongly recommend these 3 articles. They do a really good job of summarizing the research or the work that some people are doing in this area. And then if we could go to the last slide. And I've put these articles as well as the PowerPoint presentation in a Google folder that is public. If you click that, it'll take you to the folder. The 3 articles are there. That little video that I showed was there. The PowerPoint presentation is there. Okay? Again, really, really grateful to be with you all. It's a privilege for me to do that and to participate in this work of justice together. Thanks.